Hey friends, glad you could join this channel today. And if you've been here before, you know that this channel exists to reveal Jesus in the Old Testament scriptures, even though he didn't come along till 400 years after the last book of the Old Testament was written. Jesus is foreshadowed and foretyped. He's prophesied about in the Old Testament, finds that fulfillment in the New. And I spent probably a year going through the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and every chapter we looked at where Jesus was prophesied there. And now I've moved on to Exodus and just finding him all over the place. It's been pretty fun for me. I hope you've enjoyed it too. But let me start this one by asking a question. And if you saw the teaser on Facebook, you know the question. And that is, do you ever get hangry? You know, where you haven't eaten for a while and your blood sugar level drops and you're irritable. I get that way. And you know, some Christ followers that I know, they've said to me that, oh, I love to fast. I feel so spiritual. And I'm thinking, really? I don't feel spiritual when I fast. I feel grumpy. It's probably one of the reasons why my wife doesn't really enjoy it when I fast, because I get grumpy. And that's just the reality. And it's not just a Christian problem. It's in the Muslim faith too, because if you know anything about Muslims, you know that right now they're celebrating Ramadan, which is a 30-day fast. And most everybody that can participate does participate. And they fast during the day, and then in the evenings they'll break fast, and they'll sometimes with friends and family. So that part of it's kind of cool. And at the very end, they have a huge celebration of food. And so there's some cultural things about it that I think I like. I don't go for the spiritual lessons there because I don't hold to their theology, but I do like the cultural aspects of it. Anyway, they also get hangry. The Muslims deal with this as well. In fact, so much so that Muhammad said in the Quran, and this is a paraphrase because I saw it on a couple of different websites and I didn't have the actual quote, but the paraphrase is that if you're angry, he said, or if somebody is angry against them, tell them, I'm fasting, because everybody understands when you're fasting, you're going to get a little angry. You're going to get hangry. And it happened in the Bible too, in the story of Exodus. Once the people got set free by God from Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, saw the miracles of God, and they came into the desert, all of a sudden they didn't have any food. And they were not just hungry, they were angry. They were grumbling against Moses, okay? And I think the same thing can happen today, not just in a physical sense, and this is what I want to get at today as I see this revealed in the scriptures, but in a spiritual sense, I think people who are hungry for God grumble against him. Even atheists. It's been my experience, and I've met several in my days as a minister, just kind of talking with them and sharing Christ and talking about faith and issues. Many of them don't believe in God on the one hand, but on the other hand, they're really mad at him, which doesn't make any sense. Now, I get it. They're mad at Christians, and they're mad at how the Christians have messed up, and how can there be a God if Christians act like that? I get all that. I understand all that. But a lot of them are also angry at God too. I once had a skeptics group, and it consisted of me. I was not the skeptic, although I'm skeptical about some things. And also in that group was an agnostic and then two atheists in the group. And one of the atheists, she was so pissed at God, she would grumble during the entire session. So she was hangry, but in a spiritual sense. So I'm going to call her spangry. That's right. She was spangry. Do you know that spangriness, since I'm making up words, I'm going to add that one to it. Spangriness finds its origin in the Exodus story. So we're going to look at chapter 16 today. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just read parts of it. But starting in verse 1, the whole Israelite assembly set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month when they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, here's where it says, the whole community grumbled against Aaron and Moses. The Israelites said to them, if only we have died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death, which is such a dumb conclusion for these guys. I'm sorry. Notice the people were hungry, so they grumble against Moses and Aaron. They were both hangry and spangry. And I mean, they know that they don't believe, rather, or they don't know that God is going to provide for them, which is really crazy because he just performed all these miracles in Egypt to deliver them. He brought them across the Red Sea on dry ground. And when the Egyptians came after them to kill them, God brought the sea over the Egyptians and drowned every last one of them, destroying all 600 chariots that they had, completely annihilating Pharaoh and his army. So you've seen all that God has done for you in delivering you. How is it then that you think that he's going to somehow starve you to death in the desert? It makes no sense. It is part of the human condition, I think, where we have short memories about what God's done for us. Anyway, that's the case for them. And so they're hangry. They don't believe that God will really care for them. You see that? They don't believe it. They don't believe that God's going to feed them, so they become angry. And it's crazy and sad at the same time. But God in his grace, he feeds them anyway. Look at verse 6. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening, you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning, you will see the glory of the Lord because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses said. And he also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard you grumbling against him. Who are we that you are not grumbling against us, but you're grumbling against the Lord? Then Moses told Aaron, say to the Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. While Aaron was speaking to the entire Israelite community, they looked into the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. That's what you call a ruh-roh moment. They're in trouble now. So the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. So that evening, quail came and covered the camp. God miraculously sends these birds in. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost, so kind of the origin of frosted flakes, I'm thinking, were on the ground on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? That's how Jews talk back then. What is it? For they did not know what it was. But Moses said to them, it is the bread of the Lord has given you to eat. It's the frosted flakes. They're great, right? That's what Moses said to them. All right, skipping down to verse 31. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. It sounds like frosted flakes to me. I don't know, but I wonder if somebody with Jewish descent came up with frosted flakes idea. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, they called it manna. Manna means, what is it? But if when you look back up in verse 12, God tells the people, you're going to eat meat and you're going to eat bread, and then you're going to know that I am the Lord your God. I am the I am, as God is saying. You're going to know it. So the people, they did not believe that God would feed him. So God in his mercy fed them. And then he tells them, you will eat and you will know, you'll believe. So I want you to see that connection between believing in God and being spiritually filled. This is what is being foreshadowed for the New Testament, for the time of Christ, because there's a connection between our faith and our fill in the spiritual. Okay. I don't know if you knew that. Jesus completes this idea in the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, Jesus, you might recall, he feeds the 5,000. He's got a couple of loaves of small barley loaves and some fish. He's basically got some kids' sack lunch, which is a fish sandwich, the first McFish sandwich ever made. And he multiplies that and feeds 5,000 plus women and children. The Bible just counted the men at that time. So that's a big number of people he fed. And the people are so impressed that they want to just like make him king by force. And Jesus knows this. It's not the time for that. That's coming in the end times. And so he hides himself, sneaks on a boat, crosses the lake to the other side. Well, the people, they're looking for him the next morning. Where'd he go? They heard he's on the other side of the lake. So they go all the way around the lake, this massive mob of 10,000 people. And they get to the other side of the lake and they find him. They said, Rabbi, when did you get here? What's happening? And we pick up the story in John 6:26. Jesus answered him. He says, I tell you the truth. You are looking for me not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Then he says something really interesting. He says, do not work for food that spoils. That's the food that he created for them, but rather for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him, God the Father has placed a seal of approval. So notice they ate the bread and had their fill, and then Jesus pivots from there, and he says that the food in the natural is not what you should work for. You should work for the spiritual food. Natural food helps us live in these natural bodies, but spiritual food helps us live for eternity. It gives us eternal life. And then they say, well, if we're going to work for that spiritual food, what is the work that God requires? And Jesus responds, and here's the connection. He says, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he had sent. You see, so when we believe in the one that God has sent, we then have spiritual food, and we are spiritually satisfied, and we're no longer spangly, so to speak. Does that make sense? So, so in verse 29, Jesus talks about John chapter 6. Jesus says it's all about believing in the Son of God. So his followers say, okay, if that's the case, you want us to believe, then why don't you do another miracle and we'll believe? Like say, do a miracle like Moses did in the desert. Bring some manna or something, And Jesus goes, Moses didn't give you the bread. God gave it to you. Then he says something really cool. He says, I am the bread from heaven. I am the bread of life. Ultimately, Jesus says Jesus Christ is the bread of life that comes down from heaven. Are you getting it? First comes the natural bread for the natural body in the Old Testament, which foreshadows the spiritual bread for the spiritual body in the New Testament. If you ate the manna in the Old Testament, you lived, you didn't die, and you were no longer angry, hangry, spangry. In the New Testament, if we trust in Jesus Christ, put our faith in him, we are consuming the spiritual bread, and we're no longer spangry. We get to live for all eternity. That is the picture we have here in this story. Now, did the crowds believe Jesus? No, they didn't. Because in verse 41 of chapter 6 of John, they grumble against him. They actually grumble just like their forefathers did in the desert. You see, they're spiritually hungry, but they don't believe Jesus is the Son of God, and they become angry. Do you see the connection? If you today are an atheist listening to this broadcast, you might want to check your soul. If you think you have one, I don't know if you do or not, but you do. I mean, I know you have one. You may not think you do, but you do. But you might want to check your inside thoughts. Let's go with that and see if you're really angry at God, the one that you don't believe in. Do you find yourself grumbling against God? Meanwhile, he's offering you something to eat, true food, the bread of life. He's offering to you his son, Jesus. And if you want to persist in unbelief, you can do that. You have free will. God isn't going to force himself on anyone. In fact, Jesus even told the crowds in that same discourse, well, let me read it. It's in John 6:43. He tells them, quit grumbling, stop your whining, he says. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. As it is written in the prophets, they were all taught by God. Everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him, Jesus says, comes to me. No one has seen the Father except the one who's from God. Only he has seen the Father. I tell you the truth. He who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread. Here's Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. Your forefathers ate manna in the desert, yet they died. But here is the bread, speaking of himself, that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give up for the life of the world. Jesus says, quit your grumbling. I'm the spiritual food. Consume me, and you'll have eternal life. But if you want to do that, then that's your call. Only the ones that the Father draws are those who will eat. So are you spangry today? Are you spiritually hungry today? Just want to invite you to come to the table. There's room for atheists to come to the Lord's table. Come and taste the bread of life. Stop being mad at him. Start believing in him. Jesus says, taste and see that the Lord is good. He's promised, in fact, to turn no one away from the table that comes to him in faith. And listen, just like there's nothing better than grandma's hot, fresh, from the oven, homemade bread, you guys, there's nothing more better than spiritually than God's fresh from the heavens bread. You feel me? The bread of life, Son of God, Jesus Christ. So go ahead and take a bite, because if you believe, you're taking a bite. Would you do that? If you do, you'll have eternal life. And maybe you're still skeptic. I don't know. You couldn't be. That's your call. I guess what I would suggest is that you take a bite in this way. Get a Bible and just go to the Gospel of John and just say to the Lord, even though you don't believe, you say, Lord, I don't believe you're there. But if you are, I'm going to read this book, this Gospel of John. If you're really there, would you speak to me? And I bet you he does. I bet you he will do that. What do you got to lose? You don't believe in an afterlife anyway. You might as well just check and see if there's one there. Go ahead and read the Gospel of John, and I guarantee you he will speak to you. Hey, thanks for checking out my channel. Thanks for listening today, and we'll see you all next week. Bye for now.